to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Jackie Lukman, sitting in for Sean Blackman here with Wyatt Reed, and as always, we're your guide to connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And it's Friday, so we're having another edition of our weekly segment, the Redspin Report. This week, we're discussing sports, politics, and struggle with Miguel Garcia, creator and host of Sports as a Weapon podcast. Miguel, so thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely. And, I don't think there's anything else to talk about this week, Miguel, other than two words, Tim Tebow. Maybe four words if you want to say Tim Tebow versus Colin Kaepernick. But, the Jaguars locker room is split, actually, on Tim Tebow joining the team. So what's coming out of the locker room? Who's happy, who's not, and what's being said?
So I've been seeing reports that a lot of the Jacksonville Jaguars on the team, like you're saying, they're divided, and they're some of them are not very happy with Tim Tebow getting signed. And for listeners, if you do not know, the new head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars is Urban Meyer, who was Tim Tebow's coach at the University of Florida in Gainesville when Tim Tebow was the star quarterback in college, which was also like the pinnacle of his football career. So I think some of the players see the white privilege. I don't really like to use the word white privilege. I like to get straight to the point and just say, the subtle white supremacy of signing Tim Tebow.
That's
has
right.
Not played in the NFL since 2012, and Colin Kaepernick last played in 2016. And the reasons Tim Tebow hasn't played in the NFL is because he just wasn't very good. His accuracy as a quarterback was not very good. And at the time, they tried to convert him to other positions like they typically try to do with the racism of black quarterbacks. But Tim Tebow did not want to move to a different position. So then he decided to play minor league baseball with the New York Mets. And so now that his old coach is coaching the Jaguars, he suddenly is getting signed by the Jaguars to try to make the team as a tight end. And to me, it's obviously a marketing ploy because Tim Tebow is very loved in Jacksonville. So I see it as a marketing ploy, but it's also just another example of a white player getting another opportunity while Colin Kaepernick is still sitting out there, all because, he protested a racist anthem flag.
Yeah, Miguel, I know we don't have a whole lot of time today, but I am glad to have you on the show. Normally we have Nate Wallace on your podcast, Sports as a Weapon. Another fascinating, another really interesting sports podcast that I really recommend listeners check out. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the interesting interviews, insights that you've been discussing recently? I know you had a particularly interesting episode about Glenn Burke, the little known but the first openly gay player in the Major League Baseball. You also had a really interesting discussion with Frank Gurity. Y'all hit on basically how Texas revolutionized sporting culture in the civil rights era. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what y'all are hitting on?
Okay, so I just started my podcast this past summer, like a lot of people during the pandemic, but I had this Sports as a Weapon idea since I was in grad school in San Jose in 2014. It was just a website. I was writing a little bit, but I didn't keep up with it. But now I'm starting to do podcasts. And like you said, I just recently, a few episodes ago, did an episode on Glenn Burke, who was the first openly gay baseball player in the MLB. And he was also a black man and the inventor of the high five. So I interviewed the author of the book Singled Out, The True Story of Glenn Burke, Andrew Marinis. And so Glenn Burke grew up in Oakland it was post-war World War II. He was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s and 70s, and graduated from Berkeley High School in, I believe, 1970. So while he's growing up, This is also obviously during the Civil Rights era and the rise of the Black Panthers, the free speech movement in Berkeley. So Glenn Burke was also influenced by those movements, and he was drafted by the Los Angeles Dodgers and he was one of their top prospects. He was a center fielder, and he was once compared to the great Willie Mays. In his first 2 seasons, he did pretty well. His first season, the Dodgers make it to the World Series in 1977, and they lose to the New York Yankees. So everything was going well with Glenn Burke up to that point. And then after that, I believe the Dodgers were spying on him, according to Andrew Marinus' writing in his book. I guess they were spying on him. So they found out that he was gay. So at the time, the Dodgers pretty much tried to make him they asked him to get married and, pretty much hide his sexuality. But he refused. And after that, he was traded to the Oakland A's. And then a couple years later, he's out of the MLB. And then I also spoke to Dr. Frank Gurity of Columbia University, a historian of sport and society. And as you said, he wrote a book on how Texas revolutionized sports. And what was really interesting about his book is this is during the Civil Rights era, and it was like another example of woke capitalism at times as well, because a lot of these revolutionary changes in sports that happened in Texas were actually because a lot of rich oil men decided to bring pro sports to the MLB. So I would check that out. I would check out his book, and if you want, you could go listen to my podcast. I recently just had an episode with Eric Nussbaum, who wrote the book Stealing Home, Los Angeles, the Dodgers, and the Lives Caught in Between. And it's the story of Chavez, Ravine, or Palo Verde, La Loma, and Bishop. They were the Mexican Chicano indigenous community that was displaced to build Dodger Stadium in the 50s. But an very interesting thing about this whole story of Chavez Ravine was originally it was supposed to be a public housing project. The city of Los Angeles obviously did not ask permission of the residents to build this project, but the reason the project did not come to fruition was because of Red Scare politics. So pretty much, there was some organization called CASH, Citizens Against Socialist Housing, who pretty much went against this project and derailed it, and they ruined the career of the city official who was in charge of this project, who was outed as a communist during the, this is the McCarthyism era. There's HUAC, House of Un-American Activities. So that's another episode. That's my recent episode that I just did, and I think that's interesting. The anniversary was just this past week on May 9th when they kick out one of the last families of Chavez Ravine. And I thought it was interesting that I dropped this episode this week because if others have not heard, the Oakland Athletics just announced that they might relocate and move out of Oakland. And so that was just, another recent example of pro sports teams trying to use public funding and citizens, to get what they want with their stadiums.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, as we're looking at the nexus between sports and politics, whether it's, your great podcast, Miguel, or, Nate's great podcast, we're always seeing the connection between capitalism and the moral bankruptcy of capitalism and, capitalists behind these sports teams and the decisions that they make, whether it's signing Tim Tebow after not having played for years and still blackballing Colin Kaepernick, or if it's, whole owners of teams deciding to either build a stadium in a poor neighborhood and not pay taxes to support that neighborhood, or to move a sports franchise out of a neighborhood and take whatever jobs and revenue out of that neighborhood that exists. It's all reflective of the moral bankruptcy of the capitalist underpinnings, even of sports and entertainment. But we are out of time for this segment. We're going to have to leave it here. I want to thank Miguel Garcia so much for joining us for this segment of the Redspin Report. But we will be right back after this with another hour on By Any Means Necessary. Necessary on Radio Sputnik. I'm Jackie Lukman here with Wyatt Reed in Washington, D.C. And here we are, as always, connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
By any means necessary.